Hello and welcome to my compositing tutorial, or I'll show you how to use the node editor in Blender. First I'll show you the scene that I made in the introduction, but I'm not showing how to animate, so the scene that I show you how to make will not be exactly the same as that. So let's start with the startup file. And I animated this in Voodoo, so you need to go to the text editor, find the track, run the script, delete the thing that isn't working, run the script, and I'll set that to 300, and that won't work. Tried pressing Control-Alt-0, and let's see this, so I can get the background. Clip editor, and looking for this. Okay, so now set its background, and I want this to be more opaque so I can more easily see what I'm doing. Now just move the camera using the empty here. Let's delete this one, and using this empty, which the camera is parented to, you can move this first. Rotate that by -90 degrees, and just this. And what I want to do is find this grid here. I'll turn down the opacity so you can see it more easily. Not that low. Let's try 0.5. There. We want the grid lines here to match up with the ground, just to make our lives easier. So rotate that. So when you're dealing with the Blender internal motion tracking, that's what it's asking about when it wants to know when it's asking like what's the ground. It wants to align the camera to the ground, but I used Voodoo because I'm lazy or time efficient. Although I didn't really do anything with my time while I was rendering, so I guess lazy is the proper description. So now let's turn that up and scale this along the x-axis a little more. And this will be the shadow surface. What it does is just collect shadows that are projected onto it, and then we use them. Now let's put the cursor selected and get a monkey and try to align it so it's lying on the ground, and then let's put the cursor on selected, and from the origin point of the cursor scale up the monkey. That's better. And now I want to put this down one layer, and let's look at this. So I want this to be the foreground layer. I just need an E. I'll just call it render layer because I have no idea how to spell anything. And let's call this background because that is the one English word I can spell, apparently. And now set that to the mask layer, and I'll show you what the mask layer does a little later. Just this, sky, and I found an issue if you don't do sky with the new update of Blender, so you want to do that. And environmental lighting. 0.25 is a good starting point for the lighting, and I'll turn this to black because if it's gray it annoys me. I don't know why though. And let's choose this material, so then we have control over what color it is. If this is a material, and call it monkey, and call this ground. And now I need a lamp, sun, and shadows won't work unless when you set this to ray shadow, and I like to set it to this layer only because there are some issues that putting this on this layer only. can solve. So that, and it won't work unless the sun is on both layers. There we go, and now let's try rendering that. It's gonna look weird. This is exactly what it looks like when it's rendered. So now let's make it look something like what we want it to look like. So this, and this is the render layer, and let's get a viewer node here. Hold shift to connect those to make things easier. And let's set the resolution correct because I forgot to do that earlier. And render. What do we get? A monkey head, which is exactly what we want. So, or at least at this stage, and let's get rid of that because it irritates me, along with many other things. Let's get the background, and as you can see, it's just the shadows, which is what we want. Let's go back to layers because there are some other things that we want out of these. Vector and shadow and ambient occlusion, AO. And now to the movie clip. So basically I'm doing what the Blender internal motion tracking will do automatically, except I'm explaining what it does, which Blender internal motion tracking will not do automatically. Then let's go to distort, movie distortion, and choose the same movie, clip, and now distort, scale to make sure that everything is on the proper scale. Set that to render scale, and let's put that right there. And there. It doesn't matter what angle that hits that at. Well, it does to me because among everything else that I changed out of OCD, it annoys me. So now what we want here is to get, or first we want to have this appear in front of that. So let's find here. What was I looking for again? Not viewer. Color. Alpha over. And choose that. Now let's look at this. The alpha. Look at it. So if I did not uncheck the sky, in recent experience, this would all be white. It includes the sky. So now that's the end of that importance. So let's change the lamp angle because the sun is not shining like directly down. If you look down here, you can see it seems to be pointing a little this way. So that's how to describe that in other words, is this way. And let's turn off auto render because it's slowing me down at the moment. So move that, maybe a little less, and now auto render back on, and render. And while that's rendering, let's this ready. There, now it looks a little different. And let's get the invert color thing. I call it a filter, but then there's filters down here. So let's get a color mix, a mix node. I guess I'll just call them nodes. And ambient occlusion. And the ambient occlusion one should be on top because it just makes the organization easier when you get to the next step. But for now, let's get another mix. Add that right there. So what it does is, looking at this, the invert, is this is just nothing anywhere except for on the ambient occlusion. It's just nothing except for where the alpha exists, or the alpha value is when f is more than 0. But this is the inverse of the alpha value, so then when you add them together, you get this. Only dark where there's ambient occlusion. And we'll want to do the same thing for the shadow. So let's get that there, and put the shadow there. Not specularity, shadow. And let's put the shadow there. That is not what I want to tap. There. Now duplicate that, set that to multiply, which basically means 0 is black and white is 1, and gray is somewhere in between. Perfectly gray is 0.5. So basically it's like adding only for darkness, essentially. And let's turn that down, because as you can see, there's not very visible shadows. Let's set that to 0.4 and put the same multiply filter here. Put that there. Now you can see from here it's getting darker where there are shadows, but I want to turn this up. There, so most of the shadows are ambient occlusion. Right there. And now you can see the difference between this and no shadow, where no shadow looks like this, and then the shadow there looks like that. And that's basically what the Blender internal motion tracking will do automatically, except everything will be at 0.8. These will all be at 0.8, so you'll have to change them manually if you want it to look more realistic for a day. Like, depending on the lighting situation, the ambient occlusion is going to be at a different value relative to the shadow. And you want the ambient occlusion to be on top, because the ambient occlusion doesn't really change in brightness, while shadow does in different lighting situations. And then the last thing we want to do is blur this. Well, not the last, but concerning shadow, the last thing is that set that to 5 and that one to 5. And let's try 7. And you could just export the properties of all of these different nodes separately and then assemble them together in a video, in one video, away from all of this stuff, because rendering the different lighting situations is pretty CPU intensive. So if you already have rendered videos, it can take less time, but this is a relatively simple setup here, so it doesn't matter too much. And now let's deal with the speed. Here, filter, vector blur, and set that there. And now if it's moving, you can set these to different values. Like sample will it'll make more detailed blurs, which can work better or worse depending on the type of camera you're using. And then you can set the blur, which changes when you have different shutter speeds for the camera. And one thing that you might want to do to fake depth of field, because depth of field here, all you have to do really is set this to the depth of field being an object, just make an invisible object and put that in a place relative to a camera. But so far, Blender cannot deal with external depth. Like if you take the Z value and put it here, it's just white. It doesn't have like proper depth yet. So what you want to do to fake depth of field in the background is go to filter, blur, and set it to a pretty low value, like 2. And then that can make the background look blurry, and you have a more clear image here. And considering the camera that I was using for this, you might also want to set that to blur. And that's the basics of the compositing, but then you can go into more detail. Like if you want this to be shiny, you can go to mirror and set the reflection value to 0.15. Set the Fresnel, which is basically, the higher the Fresnel value, the less reflective it is at the front, but gets more reflective if you're looking at it from an angle. So, let's set that to 0 Fresnel, 100% gloss, and completely reflective. When you get this, it's going to look really weird. One thing I want to do, which will kind of show what it looks like smooth. I think it'll look a little better. You'll see it reflects the ground, which is completely just white, and reflects the background, which is this. So if you want it to actually be reflecting the world around it, you'll have to go into image or movie. So nothing there. Let's go here and choose the background, the same background that we have there, and set it to image sequence, and then match movie length as I can, and it won't work unless you click that. And now when you render it, you can see that this is reflecting the background but still reflecting the ground, which when it eventually finishes, it will not look realistic. Wait for it. Wait for it. Done. So you can see the ground is not white, yet it's reflecting a white ground. So if you want to do this in detail, you should just take a picture of the ground, and then you set that as the texture there. But I did not do that, and I could go back and do it, but I don't want to. So all that, one thing that you could do is start off with the eyedropper tool, click part of the ground. Let's try again, that wasn't a very good part. And now you can go turn down the specularity, won't matter. And let's go ahead and saturate this a bit more, because when it's more saturated, in different lighting situations it's going to become less saturated, so you want to start with it as saturated as you can make it, still realistically, and then adjust the saturation from there. And as you can see, this doesn't look very good, but it will look better if it won't look as bad if you click on the monkey and change its reflectivity to something less. Because a monkey a monkey head is ridiculous if it's that shiny. And there we go, it looks a little better. And now you just adjust the values of light, set that to flat because I want to. Running out of excuses for why I'm doing things. It's just here it is. And I'm going to set up the environmental lighting a little higher because in the background it is higher. And then you might want to go here and adjust the saturation. Like if this looks more saturated in color than it does in the video, you'll want to set it to look less saturated. Because I think it's best if you adjust your image to work best with the video instead of like saturating the video more to match the image, even if you want to color correct it to be more saturated later. Now something else to do, you could choose this. If you want to have something to have glare, here's what you have to do. Let's set that's 5. And then to add glare, go to Filter, Glare, and I'll start with Fog Glow, because it's my favorite kind of glare. 0.3, and render. Find that size 9 and threshold 0.3 are good to start out with. And the threshold is basically the lower it is, the easier it is. Just drop something. The lower the threshold value is, the easier it is to have glare. For example, if the top is shining, then I want to set the threshold up. And I forgot to assign these. Done. Render. Now its eyes should be just glowing a lot. And I keep dropping this. Threw it across the room where I won't be messing around with it anymore. And that's the SD card that holds that had the video on it. My camera had my computer has an issue that it keeps slipping out. It doesn't click in there, you just slide it in and slide it out. So yeah, on my computer at least that messes up a little. So yeah, I'm setting that up, and as you can see, its eyes are glowing creepily. Then you can animate it how you want. If you're animating it, you'll probably want to add motion blur, which is vector blur here. And I would put it before the glare, but you could really put it wherever you want. I don't think it matters too much. And yeah, that's the basics of compositing. An interesting fact: if you set the background to have an image, but delete the sky, or uncheck the sky, you can render something to have reflections of the background, but it won't have the background in the image. And then some advice: you should render it in frames as PNG files always, and then go back and render those PNG files to stitch them into one video. Because if you render them as a video, sometimes if you have a long video, it won't work properly, and it also gives you the freedom to stop rendering and start again without losing any progress. So you should keep those in mind when you're doing videos, and good luck.